From the levellers to those who trespassed at Kinder Scout, ordinary people are the ones who change history.
Justice is our liberation.
Yeah, I can only begin to imagine the experience it is for people to be coming and attending our presentation. The title of our discussion is U.S. Militarism, Space Tech and the Climate Crisis, and the Role of Demilitarization in Climate Justice. If you could go ahead, everybody who is tuning in, you're very welcome to put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. We have the Q&A to use for questions and answers. We'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. And in the meanwhile, just be mindful, everybody, of how we interact and use this space. I think we're all learning as we grow as an activist community how to be thoughtful and caring and kind to one another. And the situations that we face as a people, they can be incredibly overwhelming, and they can incite a lot of, internal anger and angst, which is completely understandable. However, the way we talk to each other, let's try to be mindful of being kind and caring and compassionate to one another. And that will kind of lead me into why care and justice is important. And I was really happy to see COP26 making this kind of a part of its messaging and program. We want to build healthy, reflective and self-sustaining social movements that collectively challenge and confront structural issues of violence, exploitation, and oppression. And in order to do that, we have to build relationships with one another, and those relationships, we have to nurture them. In our actions towards each other, we can model the kind of world we would like to see, and one that can embrace not only the changes we want in terms of how our resources and climate and environment are treated by humanity, but also how humanity, we all treat one another. So ground rules: we do not accept any verbal or physical violence. We avoid using oppressive language. We aim to create a resilient community, and we actively challenge our privileges. So just be mindful that when people are speaking, they're speaking from their experiences. Let's not assume we know what the life of others is like, that we should value active listening and really hearing one another, and allowing space for us to be in community. So that is all part and parcel of active solidarity and practice, that how we interact with one another is as important as the goals we would like to achieve as a collective. So COP26 has done a lot of work to try and help ensure that the spaces are accessible. We, unfortunately, there are a lot of talks. Not all panels can be translated. That's something I think, we should all be mindful of working on, is to build the bridges across the language barriers. But that we want to make all of our spaces as accessible as possible, and kind of sharing information about the level of interaction and accessibility in each of the panels and actions. If you're fortunate enough to be in Glasgow to participate in person, hopefully you've seen that as an experience for yourselves in there. We also want to ensure that people are comfortable, that we're mindful of creating safe space, that BIPOC, queer, cis, that people are made to feel welcome. And that's all part of building relationships. So, we are going to be kind of covering a heavy topic. I know that a lot of the topics that people are in discussion about are incredibly important. I'm very happy to be joined by 4 amazing activists, and I'm going to give some bios before we get started, and then our panelists will each hand it over to the next person in turn when you're finished with your presentation. To give you a little bit of information about myself, my name is Adrienne Kinney. I am from upstate New York. I served in the United States military from 1994 to 2004 as an Arabic linguist. I joined the peace movement in 2007. I'd been out of the military for a few years, and I remember getting very upset and angry about everything that was coming out in the news regarding torture, extraordinary rendition, learning more and more about government spying on their own citizens, not to mention that I had already thought that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were a mistake to begin with. But I joined the anti-war movement in 2007, and I've been incredibly active, first in Iraq Veterans Against the War, and now with Veterans for Peace for the last 14 years. I'm really pleased to be able to share this space with the fellow panelists. Our next speaker will be David Collins, a Royal Marine officer veteran and longtime Veterans for Peace UK member, who has previously attended the COP25 climate change conference in Madrid. David and VFP UK's goal is to increase awareness of the impacts of war and militarism on climate change, and raise the awareness that war is not the solution to the problems we face in the 21st century. Our next speaker will be Kuhan Pakmander. Kuhan is a Hawaii-based journalist and media educator. She is a board member of the Global Network and the Code Pink working group, China is Not Our Enemy. She formerly served as campaign director of the Asia Pacific program at the International Forum on Globalization. We will also be joined by Lisa Savage, a retired teacher organizer and past candidate for the US Senate. She is a founding member of the Maine Natural Guard and blogs at Went to the Bridge. And Ashik Siddiq, National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Ashik is a research analyst for the National Priorities Project, working on an analysis of the federal budget and military spending. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's perspectives. One of the things that I remember in my own kind of activism is first, since I was a kid, even really thinking and caring about the environment. And I think that that's something that is kind of innate for people to really appreciate the world around them. And as children, you're exploring that world and you're wanting to get into all the nooks and crannies and climbing trees and being out riding your bike and being able to breathe the air and drink the water and just experience life. And as you grow up, you realize that people don't always treat the world the way it should be treated. And then you grow up more and you realize it's not really just the people, it's our governments and institutions that have different priorities that don't really align with what I think and what many of us think should be the priorities we have as a people and a species sharing this planet with other beings. And yet I still joined the military, and it was a good, I spent 10 years in the military, and I knew there were things that the military did and have done, like using Agent Orange and other toxins, and there were concerns about chemicals being used on post and being stationed out in California. California often experiences drought-like conditions, and yet the military would be watering the cement because the sprinklers, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And I just remember people in the military saying, well, we're a federal government, we don't have to listen to the state's laws or mandates. And the more I became aware, the more of a contradiction, particularly with the wars in Iraq, most any wars, it's oftentimes about fighting for, not to oversimplify, but control of natural resources, and simultaneously using the most natural resources in a single act that people organizing can do. So the US military by far is one of the largest single user of natural resources and producer of toxins and carbon and all sorts of emissions. And it's honestly, it's mind-boggling. And in the United States alone, I want to say we have over 1 million environmentally based causes and concerns, projects, working groups, Sierra Club, all sorts of different, from the local to the national to the international level. And there are very few that talk about the military's impact on our environment. And so that is what this talk is all about. It's not saying that the military is the only impact on our environment, but it's one that is at such a high level that we have to start talking about the military's impact on the environment if we hope to save the planet and save ourselves. And without further ado, I would at this point like to pass the baton over to David, our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Adrienne, for the introduction. Much appreciated. Can I be made a share screen? Can I be authorized to share a screen? Has that been done?
You should be able to do that if you just click on the share screen option.
Okay, so I'm speaking from my bedroom in the house of a very kind couple, Julia and Jonathan, who are kindly hosting me here in Glasgow, although I live in London. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace UK based and have served, as Adrian said, in the Royal Marines for 9 years. That was a very long time ago. And for the past 20 years, I've worked in the renewable energy sector, specializing in biogas production from anaerobic digestion, and was involved in the Renewable Energy Association in persuading the UK government to bring in feed-in tariffs to support renewable energy production of electricity, heat, and green gas. I'm also a member of the Movement for the Abolition of War, whose message here at COP26 is war causes climate change and climate change causes war. And my talk is from the perspective of the UK as Scotland hosts the COP26. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations has called climate change the defining issue of our time, stating that almost every day we are confronted by its growing and increasingly pervasive effects. It is no coincidence that those countries most vulnerable to climate change are also liable to conflict and fragility. Some see, try and share this now. Can everybody see that?
Not yet, David. I'm going to try one more time.
Yeah. No, that's not showing.
Yeah, we're not seeing it.
I'm glad to continue without it. Now, some see the recent civil war in Sudan's Darfur region as the first modern climate change conflict. And in 2007, the UN Environment Programme argued that the desertification and dwindling rainfall had made supplies of food and water less secure, which may have helped spark the rebellion that Sudan's government put down with a campaign of genocide and mass rape. Consider Syria. Between 2012 and 2015, it was argued that climate change had been a catalyst or even a primary driver of the civil war. Headlines blamed it for the waves of refugees reaching Europe. The argument was that human emissions had caused or exacerbated a severe drought in Syria in the late 2000s that triggered mass migration from farmland into cities, contributing to tensions which ultimately led to an interminable war. Lake Chad in the 70s was once the largest freshwater lakes in the world, an oasis and commercial hub in the arid Sahel. Now it has shrunk to less than half the size, caused mostly by global emissions from countries many thousands of miles away. As the lake receded, animal herders, farmers, and fisherfolk competed for access to the shrunken supply of water in temperatures of over 45 degrees centigrade. Poverty and hunger encouraged thousands of young men to join Boko Haram and other terrorist organizations, which continue to wreak mayhem in Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. The Dutch-based Water, Peace and Security Partnership has reported that a third of the world's people now live in countries that experience high levels of water stress, with droughts affecting around 50 million people, with particular hotspots in Kenya, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan border regions, and Bangladesh, many of which have already suffered catastrophic conflicts. I and friends from MAW have been outside the delicate entrance to COP26 with a banner saying war causes climate change and climate change causes war, and our supporting leaflets are gladly accepted by delegates. But the reality is that military emissions are absent as a separate category in the negotiations. Now that this glaring omission has been noticed, the military has announced various energy-saving measures, such as improving building insulation and using biofuels in vehicles and aircraft. However, realizing that the prospect of switching farming from food production to tank fuel is viewed as verging on the insane, the military has succeeded in persuading the UK government to merge and hide their emissions at the COP within peaceful categories, such as arms within manufacture, warplanes amongst aviation, and warships under the guise of shipping. And if this is not exposed, we are well on the way to normalizing war and arms production as if it is a benign necessity. We should resist this at all costs. But what is the real risk to the UK and the world? A report by the Oxford Research Group has established that the Ministry of Defence advice to policymakers, that's the UK Ministry of Defence, is governed by the principle that even a 1% chance of a security risk materializing is unacceptable and justifies more expenditure to make us safe. A mindset that military force is the principal safeguard against external threats. Yet the UK International Climate Finance, administered by 3 UK government departments, and I quote verbatim from an existing government website, directly contradicts this strategy and states, investing in our climate finance today helps reduce costs tomorrow. Every £1 invested well in climate-related risk reduction saves more than £3 and up to £50 in avoided disaster impacts. Similarly, every pound spent cutting CO2 pays for itself between 5 and 20-fold by offsetting the future costs of climate change. ICF does this by building the resilience of the poorest people and communities. It supports countries to prepare for and adapt to climate change, improving how disasters are managed and reducing the harm they cause and the cost of responding. Even the modest current outlays based on the ICF model above for preventive action to slow and reverse climate change represent overwhelmingly better value for money than a securitized military approach that seeks to address only the symptoms of a changing climate in the form of increasing conflict across the global south. Is it worth me trying once more to try and get that share again? I press the press share screen once more.
Yeah,
Sure,
so if you
yes.
share screen and then select the file that you want to share, or select your whole desktop. If you've got a problem, David, if you can send a link to it across to the tech team, then we can try and share it for you as well. Ah, that worked.
Good. How do I change it? I can't see it. Does that change the slide? Okay, I've got it now. I apologize for that. That's a picture of the state of Lake Chad in the 70s compared with the size it is now.
Do you just need to go into presentation view rather than the view that you're in at the moment, which is the editing view? So there should be a button that you can press that says Start Slideshow. About halfway across your screen along the top, it says Slideshow.
I've got it, yeah.
Yep. And then play from current slide. There we go. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Exactly 1 month after President Ashraf Ghani led Afghanistan following 21 years of Bush and Blair's war on terror, the professional head of the British Army, General Carlton Smith, spoke at the International Arms Fair, the DSEI, held in London this September. However, the armourers and arms dealers of the world were not to hear any regrets, nor lessons to be learned from the multiple human catastrophes in Afghanistan or the wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Not even a word on the link between war and global warming, the vital role of peacekeeping at the United Nations, serious diplomacy, or the devastating effects on war on civilians, the collateral damage as these war crimes are described. No, quite the reverse, because even as the general spoke, a new UK budget was about to be announced, which an excellent analysis published 2 weeks ago by SGR revealed that in this parliament, the UK government will spend over 7 times as much on the military as on reducing carbon emissions. It also revealed the impact of the UK's foreign policy priorities, with any savings from the 30% cut in overseas aid more than swallowed up by increases in military spending. A policy of reinforcing the dominance of military solutions to world problems that has proved catastrophic is to be continued and even reinforced. So this is the largest short-term increase in UK military spending since the Korean War 70 years ago. And this slide shows the total spending for 21-25 in 3 different categories, which are fairly self-explanatory. So reducing UK carbon emissions and overseas aid, minute compared with the enormous military budget of indicated on this slide at about 180 billion. So the government has cut the aid budget over this period from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5%, which is estimated as reductions of more than 18 billion over the period. So the announced increase in the military budget, 24 billion, is comparable in scale to the 18 billion decrease in the overseas aid budget. In effect, overseas aid has been diverted for spending on UK weapons and other military equipment. Yet overseas aid includes funding for major poverty alleviation programs, including vaccines, the absence of which could lead to 100,000 extra deaths in the world. The military gets a 44% increase in the nuclear weapons stockpile, which the UN said is a breach of international law. So other measures confirmed in the spending review, such as the new road building program and reductions in air passenger duty, will actually lead to an increase in carbon emissions. This slide clearly shows the switch from overseas aid to military. On the left, minus, on the right, plus. And as the UK hosts COP26, the most important intergovernmental climate negotiations since the Paris Agreement, it is especially hard to understand why the government prioritizes engaging in international arms races in nuclear, cyber, robotic, AI, and space technologies, while funding for reducing UK carbon emissions is so compromised. How prescient were the words of US President Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell speech on 17th of January 61. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will it persist. Yet new peaceful policies are still alive in UK politics. These are the recent written pledges in the leadership election manifesto of the leader of the opposition in Parliament, the Labour Party's Keir Starmer. If I am elected, I will promote peace and human rights. No more illegal wars. Introduce the Prevention of Military Intervention Act. Put human rights at the heart of foreign policy. Review all UK arms sales. Make us a force for international peace and justice. But apparently advised that such policies would not take him to power, he has now abandoned them. But after seeing the immense energy and unequivocal determination displayed by the thousands of young people in Glasgow this week, outside the official COP, and the increasing voices of reason in our country, I believe that it's he, Keir Starmer, that is on the wrong side of history. Thank you. Should I be introducing Ashik Patnanda now?
Yeah, Ashik will go next, and then just go ahead and stop sharing your screen, David, and then Ashik will be next.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much, David and Adrian, for that setup. You have covered a lot of the territory that I'll be talking about a little bit more at length, but also try to breeze through some of what overlaps in my presentation. So my name is Ashik. I work with the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, where we do research on the federal budget and military spending, and really try to lay out all the trade-offs between the massive military spending of the US compared to all of the very crucial social priorities that are currently woefully underfunded, namely the climate crisis, which really should be funded at much more of the level than currently goes to massive military spending. So I will run through a little bit of what that looks like in practice. As David laid out, can everyone see my screen? Great. So we have put out several reports over the past few years. Last year, we put out a report called No Warming, No War that lays out a number of crucial ways that militarism fuels the climate crisis, and the climate crisis further entrenches militarism based on the current paradigms of governance in the US and allied nations. So as others have said already, the major function of the military and militarized governments is to help secure resources. Many within the military of the US have said things like fuel is the blood of the military and is critical to the life of the theater of operation, and energy is the lifeblood of our warfighting capabilities. This is pretty openly stated at the highest levels of the Pentagon, that securing fossil fuel resources is a major reason for war and a major strategic priority. Activists like Nemo Bassi have said that resource extracting corporations operate behind military shields. The militaries of the US and allied nations serve as enforcement mechanisms, basically, of corporations that are controlling the flow of fossil fuel resources. Studies have shown that oil is the leading cause of war. It's become kind of a cliche almost to say that the US and allied nations are fighting wars for oil, but it really just holds up pretty well. At least a quarter to one half of all interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to oil. And many recently, especially around the COP, have been pointing out that many of the resources that are needed in a green transition are also putting many nations that control resources like lithium or cobalt also at risk of similar dynamics, unless there are changes in governance. And in many nations, those who fight to protect their lands from extractive industries are met with securitized like state military or paramilitary violence. In 2018, the most recent year that this data was collected, more than 3 people were killed each week, and many more criminalized for defending their land and environment. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the overall budget numbers, just to put it in perspective. The US spends more on its military than the next, at this point, 10 or 11 countries combined, and more than 140 other countries all combined. So this is a massive expenditure compared to compared to China, which is presented as the rising threat to the US-led world order, is still just about a third of US military spending. And what that looks like in practice, in terms of the resources actually used, it's just a massive discrepancy between what the US spends its militarized funds on versus other nations. The US now has a military footprint in at least 80 countries around the world. That looks like over 800 military bases outside of US borders. The next country that has the most is, I think, Russia, which has something like 20 foreign bases, and China has anywhere from 1 to 3 foreign military bases. So compared to the US's over 800, it just really doesn't compare. And these disastrous wars, I probably don't need to tell folks on this call, only create more violence and instability around the world. The US military is stretched thin, over 40% of all countries, and now spends more than almost any time since World War II without any real military threat that compares to what was happening then in the world. And this is just fundamentally unsustainable if we're ever going to deal with accelerating crises like climate disruption. Within the US, the militarized spending takes up just about half of the discretionary budget that Congress allocates every year. It really dwarfs all discretionary non-military spending on public programs that should be meeting human needs. Climate funding is just a sliver of what you're seeing here in energy and environment. A lot of that is actually going toward nuclear weapons. So it's really ridiculous. And this year, for the first time in many years, it's less than 50%, only because the US government has spent an abnormally high amount on social spending after the pandemic. But in previous years, for well over a decade, it's been over 50%. And if you add to that almost 50% military spending, if you add to that militarized non-military spending, so things like Homeland Security, immigration enforcement, prisons that operate within US borders outside of the military, it's almost 2/3 of the discretionary budget. And you can see what that looks like in a militarized police violence, mostly against Black and brown people, where surplus military equipment from wars goes to local police departments and end up in these horrific scenes of violence against protesters and civilians, letting law enforcement turn city streets into war zones and suppressing dissent. It also looks like border militarization, which is a response to the climate crisis, because climate change leads to more displacement of peoples across borders. So for well over a decade, well-placed people in the Pentagon have been signaling that their response to the climate crisis would be further militarization of borders, because these are countries that have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency, but this is basically threatened by an influx of people coming in. So a logical response is to strengthen borders, to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from places like South and Central America, Caribbean islands, et cetera. And this is a response you see in the UK and Australia and many developed global north nations. And this is part of a trend that's been accelerating for many years. Over the past 4 decades, federal prison funding and immigration enforcement funding has been multiplying by like almost exponentially. The US now has one of the highest mass incarceration rates in the world, and spending on militarized immigration has skyrocketed past 17 billion since 1976, where it started out pretty low. And this funds more brutal border policing, immigration raids, mass deportations that tear communities apart. And much of the resources of agencies like Customs and Border Protection and ICE, immigration enforcement, is militarized equipment like drones that are used to surveil borders and are used increasingly against civilians. There are reports of indigenous organizers being targeted by these ICE and CBP drones. So it's really concerning. And fundamentally, this does not promote security for most people except the most comfortable already. It's state-sponsored terror against the most vulnerable people in our society. And these militarized domestic programs really violently enforce the profits of a wealthy few at the expense of the many, while preventing funding of the real things that we need against a climate crisis. To put all this in perspective, the US, this graphic is actually outdated. The US has now spent over $8 trillion on war in the past 2 decades since 9/11. And that really dwarfs the cost of things like if the government actually funded a full deployment of renewable energy to totally shift the grid, that is estimated to cost 4.5 trillion, which is just a little bit over half of the cost of wars over the past 2 decades. So that should really put into perspective that if the US government had been funding a green transition over the past 2 decades instead of endless wars, we already conceivably could have transformed the fossil fuel energy system with much more to spare. So these are really concrete things, concrete ways that resources could be shifted toward the green transition that we need. 2 big sources, according to some estimates, if we ended direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuels, that could amount to about $650 billion a year. Cutting unnecessary military spending, well, we think at the project I work on could provide at least $350 billion a year if we cut the military budget in half. So just by doing those 2 things, almost $1 trillion per year could be freed up to address climate change. And this could be done in studies we've laid out. We've itemized a number of things that could be cut that are just totally wasteful and unnecessary in the military. And if the US did that, it would still have a bigger military budget than China, Russia, and Iran combined, if one is predisposed to see those as major priorities to outcompete those nations. So yeah, just to summarize, many have said, like Reverend Dr. William Barber and Liz Theoharis, who we work on in the Poor People's Campaign in the US, our spending on war and violence is really arresting our ability to provide true security and well-being at home. There's a long tradition in the United States of social justice movements and leaders really drawing explicit connections from militarized priorities to all the social priorities we need. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And that is more true than ever in a time increasingly defined by the climate emergency. The US strategy of world military domination assures that the US has the largest military, but is completely unprepared for the existential threat of ecological breakdown. So it's really time to change course. In the years to come, like this will be a years-long project to counter this, but as part of the climate solution we need globally, it really has to include divesting hundreds of billions of dollars from states' action violence and free up resources to reinvest in the urgent human needs we need in an economy of social and ecological care.
Thank you, Ashik. I think if you are all set, then we'll pass it on to Kohan Peckmander.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Ashik, and thank you, David, and thank you to the COP26 People Summit team for giving the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space the opportunity to share some of our research. Now, as we all sadly know by now, the US military is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world and the single largest emitter of carbon emissions in the world. Its carbon emissions exceed those of entire nations like Denmark and Portugal. So we have the Biden administration now saying that they will mandate slashing carbon emissions. But my question is, the Pentagon, in contrast, it's sort of a greenwashing, because the Pentagon is now saying that they're going to transition to biofuels and electric vehicles and biofuels in their ships, trucks, and aircraft. So what is missing from this climate calculus, and here's where I'm going to share screen, is that it's not going to stop the Pentagon from decimating populations of whales and dolphins, or killing coral reefs and dredging coastal ecosystems. Our planet's oxygen supply is inextricably linked to the health of marine ecosystems. When coral reefs, coastal ecosystems, and rainforests are killed, it sets off a cascade of systems failures. Coral, plankton, algae, trees, and the soil biome that would otherwise be capturing carbon and producing oxygen are destroyed. So as far as the Pentagon is concerned with its mission, the ecocide will go on. So what if it's now running on electric vehicles and biofuels? As long as the military's mission is to dominate sea, earth, sky, and space, biofuels and electric vehicles will not stop the Pentagon from crushing the planet's inherent ability to regenerate itself in the face of climate catastrophe. Now, to make matters worse, the Pentagon is undergoing this massive paradigm shift in the way war is waged. And it will require a series of so-called smart grids to enclose the planet in 5G and sonar. This new way of waging war will mean that Earthbound mission control centers are moving into space. Brick and mortar facilities are moving to the cloud. The military base, manned with thousands of troops and armed with tanks and machine guns, like what we saw in Afghanistan, is now considered passé, which may explain why the US withdrew from that old school war so hastily and without finesse, to say the least. The military base is being replaced by what has been called a high-speed kill web. It uses information as the primary weapon of war. It will enable empire to rain terror down on any spot of the earth. A swarm of drones, hypersonic missiles, submarine torpedoes, bombers, and all with the ease of calling an Uber. This is why demonizing China is so essential, because only a foe as formidable and distant as China would justify the hyper-costly infrastructure overhaul required. War with China, and by extension with its ally Russia, requires the US to pour far more resources into military fantasies than that which would be required than your usual bombing of a small third world country. These high-tech profits will make the money made by Halliburton during the 20 years in Afghanistan look like peanuts. In order to build this infrastructure for this new way of war, reefs are being dredged and forests are being raised throughout Asia and the Pacific. An ambitious system of missile deployment facilities, satellite launch pads, radar tracking stations, aircraft carrier ports, live fire training areas, and other facilities for satellite-controlled war are being erected to embody the next century of industrial-scale institutional violence. The new infrastructure will include a grid of thousands of satellites launched into the heavens. It will also be comprised of a grid throughout the Indo-Pacific made up of mini bases, such as airstrips and rocket launch pads on as many islands as possible, indicated by the red circles here. Here is a drone. Oh, it's also on the surface of the ocean. It's also a grid of 5G devices. Underwater, it is a grid of sonar devices. And here's a drone loaded with sonobuoys that will be dropped into the ocean. Sonar devices like these will transmit whale-killing sonar signals to 5G sensors on the ocean surface. The 5G sensors will then relay the signal to land and satellite receivers. Just to give you an idea of how lethal sonar is to whales, when low frequency active sonar is activated in Hawaii, it has made the sperm whales all the way in Australia stop eating for 2 days. This is how fatally disruptive sonar is to whales and dolphins. It is equally detrimental for their mating, birthing, hunting, voyaging, everything they do. Saturating the ocean with sonar will kill the ocean. Nonetheless, this marine holocaust has been cynically dubbed the smart ocean. And here's an unmanned helicopter loaded with sonobuoys that will also be dropped into the ocean. The idea is to overlay the entire Earth with several layers of grids that will transform the planet into a real-life 3D chessboard. It is part of a master plan called the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. At the heart of the JADC2 is a data storage cloud called JEDI, now in development by Amazon and Microsoft, which happens to be one of the sponsors of this year's COP26. Other cloud companies such as Google, Oracle, and IBM have a chance to also win a slice of this deal worth tens of billions of dollars. The inaugural exercises to help develop this new gridded warfare were completed last summer in Hawaii. The new technology linked Navy and Marine Corps, sea, air, land, space, and cyber weapons spanning 17 time zones. Troops practiced blowing lots of things up in Hawaii's marine habitats by clicking on their laptops at Pearl Harbor, which is what we see here. In one exercise, Marines on Oahu struck a ship and sank it with missiles launched from a robot truck off the coast of the neighbor island of Kauai. Hold on. So the oceans sequester an astonishing amount of carbon, 2 billion metric tons per year. And much of the sequestration is due to the presence of whales. Whales are absolutely essential to the ecological harmony of our oceans. And as such, they are the primary species for mitigating and delaying climate catastrophe. There's a marine biologist named Asha DeVos, and she provides us much information and research on how whales do this. So as whales dive to the depths to feed and come up to the surface to breathe, they actually release enormous fecal plumes. This whale pump, as scientists call it, brings essential nutrients from the depths to the surface waters where they stimulate the growth of phytoplankton that form the basis of all marine life and food chains. Because of phytoplankton photosynthesis, the oceans generate more oxygen than all the rainforests of the world combined. And this is especially true now that forests have begun emitting more carbon than they are capturing. In fact, 10 UNESCO World Heritage Site forests have begun releasing more carbon than they are absorbing. This alarming development places ever more importance on our oceans to function truly as the lungs of our planet. Once whales die, their carcasses transport carbon to the deep oceans. Every year, it is estimated that whale carcasses transport 190,000 tons of carbon to the bottom of the sea. That's the same amount of carbon as that is emitted by 80,000 cars per year. One of the most ecocidal developments of modern warfare is the delusionary need for perpetual year-round military practice in our oceans. We essentially have non-stop war now taking place in our oceans, and we have for a decade, even with no war officially being waged. But war is being waged. That is a war on all the living spirits that populate the undersea community and enable our oceans to support life on Earth. The whales, dolphins, turtles, crabs, seahorses, jellyfish, algae, seaweed, eels, plankton, manta rays, and coral. Naval exercises are the cause of tens of thousands of whale and dolphin deaths per year. Pentagon documents estimate that the number of injuries and deaths caused by war practice around the Mariana Islands alone, just around the Mariana Islands, will add up to around 150,000 individuals for the 12 years between 2015 and 2027. They estimate that the number of injuries and deaths of whales and dolphins that took place in the Gulf of Alaska was over 182,000 over a 5-year period. Because there are hundreds of naval exercises throughout the Indo-Pacific every year, we can easily extrapolate that the number of fatally injured whales and dolphins to be around 100,000 per year. And that's not even counting the devastating impacts that will take place once the smart ocean is installed and operating. Basically, what we have here is the global economy is being organized around militarism. The US seems to think it can go about doing this while it simultaneously addresses the climate crisis, but that's not possible. You can't have it both ways. A weaponized Pacific is a dead Pacific, and a dead Pacific is a dead planet. The only way forward toward a livable future is through authentic climate cooperation between China and the US, because the people of the world want life. The people of the world don't want the oceans and the heavens militarized and weaponized. The people of the world want peace. And I close now and hand it over to Lisa with the thought that the word Pacific means peace. Thank you. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Kuhan, and thank you to all my co-panelists here. What a great group. We have a lot of really interesting participants as well. I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about information control, which I think is a very key element to why I agree the people want peace and they want life, yet our government, at least the US government, goes right on spending our treasure on death dealing. I'm here on behalf of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. I'm wearing this colorful t-shirt, which you can order from the Global Network, Free the Sky of Nukes and Weapons. And I'm gonna start sharing my slides now. So thanks for bearing with me here. Okay. The first slide that I would like to share with you is called Pentagon Planet. This was created by professional illustrator named Anthony Frida for my use, because I have been focusing on the carbon impact, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the climate impact of the Pentagon for a while now. The power of a really good image is, of course, far beyond words. I'm kind of a words person myself, but I do very much like working with creative people and getting them to help us get this message out in as many ways as possible. As we know, propaganda mostly works not by putting forth false facts, but more by creating a very small peephole that we are to look at the world through, and having a sort of managed narrative visible through that tiny little peephole, and giving us either directly or indirectly the message, everything outside that peephole, ignore it. It doesn't matter. It's not real. It's not valid. Pay no attention to it. I think that this has been used very, very effectively in the US, certainly. And you know, I mean, just at the most basic level, we have naming. So after World War II, all the war departments became the Department of Defense. I have a quote from a Defense Department spokesman, John Kirby, who told a military publication, Defense One, that no one would come from the Pentagon would come to COP26, but he said that Pentagon officials remain hard at work building climate resilience through the department and the force. So I translate these sort of weasel words as, we hope to survive the fire that we continue to pour fuel on. But I'm sad to say that probably most of the people in the US do not really, you know, deconstruct these statements, and they kind of take it at face value that the Pentagon is working hard on climate. One of the things that is a little bit trickier here is the climate impacts of militarized space operations. So I've been focusing on the Pentagon for a while. As we know, the last president created Space Force, and the current president kept it. I have really asked myself in preparing this presentation the questions: who knows about the climate impacts of militarized space, and who cares about them? And why is there so much silence around what you would think is a very critical issue as we, you know, head toward a tipping point that we can't get back from? There is a research group I found headed by Dr. Eunice Murray at the University College of London. And I'll be showing some of their findings in a minute. But who among the general public really knows about the research of academics without journalists or other interested parties reporting it for us? So if the general public can be kind of kept in the dark that a problem even exists, that is, the fact that militarized space operations have a terrible climate impact, most people simply won't know enough about it to care. I wanted to share a graphic that was created by the Cost of War Project at the Watson Institute at Brown University. This was created to display the findings of Dr. Nita Crawford's research into the emissions of the global war on terror. So in 2019, Dr. Crawford reported out on what she had found. I've been lucky enough to hear her speak, and I know that she said it was also extremely difficult to find data about this. So she went at it from the angle of, you know, fuel consumed, because that was something that she could find data on. The kind of jets that the military uses often emit worse greenhouse gas, you know, effect than a regular commercial jet. I really liked how some professional infographic creators were employed here, and also how they scaled it to something that most people looking at it do have experience with, and that is driving their car. And so I'm really hopeful that we will see more of this kind of helpful information, infographics and other graphics, so that we can really combat this whole strategy of communication strategy, which is to say, oh, the Pentagon is offering solutions to climate crisis, or NASA, as you'll see in a couple slides, is offering solutions to climate crisis, very much sidestepping the fact that, well, yes, they're a huge part of creating the problem as well. This is a visual that was produced by the research group I mentioned earlier. Dr. Eloise Murray and Dr. Robert Ryan of University College of London collaborated with Seb Eastham of MIT's Department of Aeronautics, and Chloe Balhatchet, I hope I'm saying that right, Balhatchet of the University of Cambridge. And they titled the page where I found this graphic, Impact of Rocket Launches and Space Debris on the Atmosphere and Climate. There's a lot of space debris up there and falling into the atmosphere and burning up, and that also, has its climate impact. Their explanation was the space sector is growing rapidly without environmental regulation. Here we have constructed an inventory of emissions from rocket launches and a burnup of returning space junk to determine the impact of current and future emissions on climate and the composition of the upper atmosphere. This shows the launches in 2019 by nation. It also gives the total weight of those launches and breaks down the fuel types used, because that often has a big climate impact. One of the ways that we find out about things in this day and age, of course, is to use search engines. And search engines sometimes work within academic university websites and so forth, but not always. Serious research is usually published in peer-reviewed publications that may not be available to the public. Let's take a look at what we get when we try to use various search engines. I've been doing this for years now, and if I enter terms like military plus climate impact, I always get lots of hits to the effect, oh, the Pentagon is very concerned, or the military in other countries very concerned about climate change, and we're working hard to figure out how to deal with it. There is never any reference to the military's role in causing climate change. So, maybe my search terms aren't that good. A search engine is a pretty blunt instrument. So I fooled around with things like, military plus climate change or climate impact. And to prepare for this presentation, I started to put in NASA, the US space entity that has climate impacts. What do we see when we search for those things? Well, we see that a NASA study is helping with the world food supply, because they have been, studying how climate change impacts. They're not studying how they impact climate change and thus impact the world's food supply, but that's something that you have to kind of deconstruct it to figure out. I loved this quote from a U.S. official, John Conger, again, speaking to Defense One, the military publication Defense One. He said, the climate crisis is often described as two complementary challenges: managing the unavoidable and avoiding the unmanageable. The unavoidable includes the worsening conditions of the next 20 to 30 years already baked in if every nation on the globe drastically cuts emissions. You can almost see the Pentagon licking its chops here, going, oh goody, climate chaos will bring so many more opportunities for us to bring security to the world. And it's very hard for people that are just kind of consuming mainstream media, corporate news, and not the people on this webinar. It's often very difficult for them to kind of see past that communication strategy and look beneath and find out that the entity is actual a cause of the problem and not a solution, as they like to present themselves. I tried NASA and emissions and got three different examples of what a great citizen NASA is in terms of climate. They've helped the Chicago airport reduce harmful carbon emissions with their technology. They've recorded China and India's sulfur emissions that are linked to millions of deaths. Again, we return to the vilifying of China as a possible next enemy for all this US military aggression, and also the Hubble telescope. Who doesn't love these beautiful nebulas and the photographs that we see of these big star systems? That came up because the word emission is in there. Takeaway, NASA is helping everybody as much as they can, looking for danger for us, trying to keep us out of trouble, and also bringing us super beautiful photos that we wouldn't have had without their technology. As has been mentioned, the drone wars that were so much in the news because of a horrible drone strike just at the end of the Afghan war that killed many civilians, including small children. And the Pentagon has now investigated itself and declared that nothing wrong was done. Those drone strikes, often conducted from Germany's Ramstein Air Base, or it's in Germany, it's a US Air Base, and controlled from the Nevada desert, But none of this could happen without satellite communications. And of course, satellite communications kind of link up the different remote players for this type of warfare. I had occasion to hear the Global Network's Dave Webb, who's got to go to the UK a radar station in Great Britain and talk to some Royal Air Force personnel that were working there, and they had chosen to work for the newly created Space Command. And they told Mr. Webb that they considered themselves space enthusiasts, and they had moved into this part of the Royal Air Force motivated by, keeping up with this interest of theirs. And they said things like, it's an exciting arena, and I get to work with new technologies, and it's about exploration. Now, since the last age of exploration resulted in widespread genocide and environmental degradation, you might think that the word exploration was no longer something positive, but I think that space is very much portrayed as being this new avenue of exploration, and we know how well that went last time. An area for which there is more research in terms of space and climate is the ozone layer. Ozone depletion is an area that there is more data on, and you can find some articles on this, but I noticed that almost all the information I found focused on private space rockets. So again, NASA or the US military were pretty much ignored, even though their emissions, of course, contribute to eroding the ozone layer as well. Billionaire space tourism has been a great distractor for the public because people either love or hate these flamboyantly wealthy individuals that are going into space. But again, where is the reporting on the climate impacts of governmental space programs? You can see that the word billionaire will crop up in the same headline with pollution, but we don't see NASA's popping up in that connection. SpaceX in particular, which is the company owned by Tesla founder Elon Musk, is an especially attractive target for environmentalists. And besides emissions, which are dealt with in this slide and really kind of quantified by a researcher, Ian Whitaker, I know that SpaceX has also been heavily criticized for the environmental destruction around its launch sites in Texas. And so again, where have we heard similar criticisms of NASA shared in the corporate press? We have not. Maybe I just need to fix my search terms again. So I tried NASA environmental harm, and all the hits that came up first were actual NASA sites, web pages. And we can see here that NASA is safeguarding our atmosphere rather than contributing to warming. So it's pretty consistent. And a parallel theme here is that not only are the military and militarized space victims of climate change and the changes that will bring about, but also NASA is depicted here as the victim of space debris. So, space debris, understanding the risks to NASA spacecraft is the way that they're presenting that to the public. Is NASA a military program? Well, even before Space Force was created, the technology that developed by NASA has been an integral part of the Pentagon's plans for full spectrum dominance of the planet. And but of course, the militarized nature of NASA was baked in from the beginning. Thousands of German rocket scientists founded NASA, and the most famous of whom is probably the Nazi Werner von Braun. I know as a retired school teacher that school children starting as young as age 4 or 5 are heavily propagandized in US schools to admire NASA's people and its missions. And identity politics comes strongly into play in these communications. Very, very much like military recruiting ads, you'll see a lot of images of BIPOC and women astronauts. And again, this is definitely pitched at children. And so that kind of look at this, don't ever look at all that out there, starts very early, and it's effective. So that's why they do it. Even in English language reporting of international space activities, we see no mention of climate impacts at all, even when they're talking about security. This is the English language press. I only can read the English language press, so I would be very interested to hear from people in other countries or other languages about, does your press do the same thing? Do your governmental agencies also, portray this in the same way, or is a little more truth leaking in there? Finally, what can we do? We all know there is no planet B. It's this one, and we all love it, and we want to live here, and we want our children and grandchildren to be able to live here. The indigenous people that have not contributed mightily to climate chaos want to live here, and they want their children and grandchildren to live here. So what can we do? I think some of us have the skills to study the greenhouse gas emissions of all space programs. And the scientists that are able to do that, will they struggle to find funding to do that? Maybe, probably. But without that data, it's very hard for us to make rational decisions about what we can afford and what we can not afford in terms of emissions in the future. Then most of us here on this call can report and share the findings of those studies. And the sort of ecological community of information sharing is extremely important. Social media platforms are used, webinars like this one, email, lots of other ways to get the word out. So we're all trying to help with that part of the job. And we can also challenge that kind of rah-rah, reporting on space programs that completely ignores climate impacts. I spend a ridiculous amount of time leaving comments on articles, just pointing out in a polite tone of voice that, what was left out of the article. And I think that, we can all consider doing that kind of work. Finally, I would like to say that, the space industrial complex is always going to be portrayed positively in the US as a jobs program. I suspect the same is true in many other countries. But if we were to convert that kind of industrial capacity to building things that mitigate the effects of climate change rather than contributing to them, economist studies show you very likely would create even more good full-time jobs with benefits than you are creating doing the highly technical and militarized building that is so much of the US economy in every location. So I thank you very much for listening to me and for being here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Oh, there we go. Wow. Just when you thought you knew how bad things were, there is just more information. I really appreciate the information and people sharing and the passion as well. It's so important. We can't organize to change things if we don't know what the things are. And the more information we have, the better. We have about 14 minutes, and we'd like to use the last 10 minutes to allow each of our speakers to have 2 minutes each to do a closing and call to action. And so in the intervening 4 minutes, I have a couple of questions that have been submitted, and hoping we can address a few of these. And then maybe if there are others that panelists have seen pop up, you might, if you can, add some reflections in your closing. Please feel free to share your contact information with us. That'll be the best way we can send the chat and links to the video to people who have tuned in for this presentation. So the first question was really for David, and regarding nuclear weapons. Oh, I see, that one has been answered. Okay, so it was a question about nuclear weapons and who is behind the purchasing and development of nuclear weapons. I know also there was a question in the chat about why is the government okay with privatizing space exploration? And I would assume it's similar to who's making the nukes. It's that the access to making profits is substantial when you are using a private contractor versus soldiers. You know, the military, funnily enough, it's a very socialistic system. Everybody gets what they need. Everybody is paid relatively the same. There isn't a lot of profit to be made, and there's, you know, some degree of oversight. But in the private sector, there are billions, if not trillions, of dollars that can be made. And I assume that is one of the reasons why they let our public goods works go to the private sector. There was another question about for Kuhan about the Indo-Pacific and why geographically that has been an area of target.
Because for the past over 10 years, it was decided by some powers that be that the United States is going to have a war sometime with China. And I first started noticing it in about 2007 when, and I actually co-wrote a book called The Super Ferry Chronicles, where this military ship that was masquerading as an inter-island ferry created this huge, what do you call it? Just waste of money, poor. It was just a big disaster project. And we found out as we researched it that its board of directors was like the Secretary of the Navy under Ronald Reagan and the Joint Chiefs of Staff for this small local ferry. And we realized that they were ramping up for war with China. So that was back in about 2005, 6, 7. Now we're 2021. And now we are seeing it's just getting hotter and hotter, the tinderbox with China. So of course, the Pacific is between North America and Asia and China. And that's why. And that, you know, they even changed the name of the command from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command, because now they're including India as an ally, as a partner to contain China and threaten China. The really foolhardy fact is that analysts from Russia, China, and the United States have determined that if there were a war waged in the Taiwan Straits, that China would easily win, hands down. If it were a conventional war, the only kind of war that the US would win would be a nuclear war. And now that Trump has withdrawn from the INF treaty, it has enabled our current military budget to include missiles and weapons that had not been legal before, manufactured by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the former, the company that Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, served on the board for many years, all the way up until he was the defense minister of the United States. So now they can manufacture missiles that had been illegal under the INF treaty, and those are long distance missiles. So you need a war with China in order to justify these very high profit margin products. Like I say, it's not about tanks and machine guns anymore. It's about nukes, AIs, robots, missiles. There's a huge amount of markup for the manufacturers, and it costs the taxpayers so much more money.
Thank you. And I appreciate the questions and comments that have been put into chat and into the Q&A. I am saving them. Some of the questions would be fantastic panels in and of themselves. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to address them in depth here. Given we have 8 minutes to wrap up, I am going to turn it over to David to be the first in a closing comments and call to action. We'll hear from each of our speakers, David, Ashik, Lisa, Kuhan, and then myself.
I can promise you mine will be finished in 1 minute because I'm totally unprepared for this question. The people are the only way this will be stopped. There is this term used, intentional apathy, which is the people do not know how to alter this. They want to, they have difficult lives. What can they do about it? The key is young people. Why don't we reduce the age of voters on future, on matters that affect the future of our people? Brexit, I should never have voted on Brexit, although I'd have voted for it. Let young people take the lead. In Glasgow, those tens and tens of thousands of young people, give them a voice. They're the people who are going to change this, I believe. If you want to change the an electoral system, and that's very hard to do. I think it has to be activism from that age. And two other things. This investment in companies that are doing this work is very powerful. They don't want to be seen to be wrecking the planet. Investors won't put money where it's going to give them a bad name. And try to reassure those who are concerned at losing their jobs when we have this huge change, a diversification. So I'll leave it at that, just a few points. Not hopeless, though.
Thank you, David. Ashik?
Yeah, I would really echo a lot of what David just said. I think just political mobilization is really important in whatever forms folks can participate in building it. Against the military budget in the US, there are a number of organizations that National Priorities Project works with, including the For People's Campaign. There's a youth organization called Dissenters that focuses a lot on divesting from the military and the trade-offs with other forms of spending like climate crisis. Sunrise Movement is also engaged on that. And I would just shout out the report that NPP has just put out on the militarized budget over the past 20 years, as well as a report on climate and militarism. And in the federal government and in Congress, there are a number of allies in the Congressional Progressive Caucus who have been pushing for the past couple of years spending cut of at least 10% of the Pentagon budget to be redirected to other purposes. So that's an effort that I hope will continue building. So there will be ways to engage on that.
Thank you, Ashik. Lisa?
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm very proud to be with the organizations represented here, Veterans for Peace and the National Priorities Project, Institute for Policy Studies, and the Global Network Against Weapons of Nuclear Power in Space have all done amazing work to bring people together, to listen to the people that are being impacted, and to share ideas about what to do. I could suggest the organization that I founded here in Maine and the USA, just for the fun of it, use your search engine and type in Maine Natural Guard. Your first hit will be the Maine National Guard, which is a branch of the Army. Search engines work that way on purpose. But if you can find your way to the second or third hit and you go to the Maine Natural Guard, you will find this is a very simple action that I urge you all to consider taking and tell your friends about. You can take a pledge that to connect the dots between climate harm and militarism. So when people are talking about security, you're going to pipe up and say, well, climate crisis is the biggest security threat to all of us right now. It's not China, it's not, it's climate crisis. And then when people are talking about climate crisis, you're going to say, and do you know who the biggest contributor to climate crisis is of any organization on the planet? It's the US military. Word of mouth and simple messages between actual human beings have far more power than corporate media would ever give credit to. But I actually believe anything that's ever changed in this world has changed by means of grassroots, people sharing information, talking amongst themselves. And I would also say, I think we need a general strike to bring this whole rotten system down. So I didn't want to pass up the chance to say, let's withhold our labor as a way of actually showing, no, we're really serious. This climate harm must come to an end so we can survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Kuhan?
Well, I put in the chat 2 organizations I'm involved with because I feel that's the best way for me to organize. We all need to organize. The other speakers have listed other ways to connect into this huge behemoth of a problem. I'm with Code Pink China is not our enemy, as well as the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space. And also, people should look into how we can support the indigenous people of the Pacific to decolonize, because much of what is happening is because there is no sovereignty or voice amongst the people of the Mariana Islands, where most of the ecocide is taking place. It's tragic because there are whole undersea ecosystems where there are still, as of yet, undiscovered species in the Mariana Trench, and they're being bombed, they're being destroyed before they've even been discovered by humanity. There recently, when I showed a picture of a forest, of a limestone forest that had been denuded, and when they did that, there were 3,000 human remains that were uncovered of the ancient, not ancient, but ancestors of the Chamorro indigenous people. Normally in the United States, people have rights. This is like it's an abuse of human rights. It's a huge violation. And yet the people of Guam, the native people, have no rights, although they are American citizens. And the boxes, the skeletons, were shoved in various boxes and put in various offices without any accountability, no legal accountability to explain where these remains went, what's being done with them. And it's like, it gives new meaning to the term skeleton in the closet. They just the military shoved all of these skeletons in closets all over the island, and nobody knows where their ancestors are. So we need to listen to the indigenous people of the Pacific Islands, because their land is being used to forward war, to project war to Asia, and to be the bases. So I go around going to these islands and meeting the people and talking with them, because they all feel terribly small and empowered. But we are now reading the work of Epeli Hau'ofa, Read Our Sea of Islands. It's a beautiful piece about Moana Nui, the great ocean that connects all these islands with the ocean superhighway. So decolonization of the Pacific is key, and it's not something we hear about a lot.
Thank you. Oh, we always have to remember to take a deep breath. And when we're trying to handle so much information and what to do, Veterans for Peace has been doing a huge push to get the Congress to put forward a resolution that would mandate that the United States military disclose its missions. That resolution has been put forward by Representative Lee. Please, encourage your representatives to reach out and look at it, and to sign on as a co-sponsor. There is so much to do, and yet, there are plenty of people willing to do the work. And I just sometimes get overwhelmed, and yet have to remember, I saw a presentation once about that lead was everywhere, because it was in fuel, it was in paint, it was in, so much of the goods we were using, and it was poisoning the planet, poisoning people. And when the world decided that to get the lead out, the level of toxins dropped dramatically and quickly. And it took sustained effort. I think the last country to get the lead out of fuel just went into effect last year. But when it began in the 80s, and it began in the United States, to the best of my knowledge, it had a tremendous positive impact on the planet. And what we need is for leaders to make the decision that now is the time to address our climate crisis and the ecocide that humans are bringing and rotting on the planet. I appreciate everybody. I hope we all stay in touch, and I wish everybody in Glasgow to represent us and do us all proud. And we're trying to do that from every nook and cranny of the planet that we can participate from. So thank you so much, everybody, and peace.